I never imagined I'd experience what happened after 43 years of marriage. When Elizabeth looked across our kitchen table last Thursday and told me she thought it would be better if I stayed home instead of joining the family at the cottage for Christmas, something broke inside me. I asked her what she meant by not coming, setting down my coffee cup. She avoided eye contact and explained that the kids believed, and she agreed, that my absence would make things easier for everyone since I had been so difficult lately. That word hung between us heavily. I asked her to explain what she meant by difficult. She responded in a tone she had adopted over the past year, patient yet strained, as if speaking to someone who couldn't quite understand. She reminded me that during Thanksgiving I had argued with Marcus about his business plans, and at Sophia's birthday I had made an inappropriate comment about her boyfriend's tattoos. According to her, the kids were exhausted from constantly being careful around me. Marcus was our 41-year-old divorced son who worked in marketing. Sophia was 38 and worked as a social worker. I believed we had raised them well. I protested that I had simply been having a conversation, pointing out that Marcus had asked for my thoughts about his idea. She countered that I had called it impractical. I maintained that it was indeed impractical since he wanted to leave his secure job to launch a podcast about cryptocurrency, and I was merely being honest. Elizabeth released one of those deep, disappointed sighs I had been hearing frequently. She said that was precisely her point, that I couldn't simply be supportive and instead had to impose my way, my opinions, and my judgments on everything. I sat there observing the woman I had loved since 1979. We had met at the University of Toronto, married young, and constructed a life together that included 3 children, a house in North York, and respectable careers. I had spent 35 years working as a civil engineer for the city, dealing with bridges and infrastructure, the type of work people only notice when something fails. I excelled at it and took considerable pride in my accomplishments. I asked if this meant that after 43 years I was being excluded from Christmas. She clarified it wasn't permanent, just for this year to give everyone some space. She reached toward me as if to take my hand, but reconsidered. She suggested I might spend the holiday with my brother instead. My brother Samuel lived in Vancouver, and we communicated perhaps twice annually. I simply acknowledged her suggestion. That night I remained awake while Elizabeth slept beside me. The house felt oppressively quiet. I reflected on all the Christmases we had celebrated at the cottage, a family tradition we had established when Marcus was 5 years old. I thought about the snow, the fireplace, Elizabeth's tourtière, watching the kids open presents, and in recent years having grandchildren running around. Now I was being removed from it all. The following morning, Elizabeth had already departed for her book club when I woke. She had left a note on the counter saying she hadn't wanted to disturb me and that coffee was ready. I spent most of that day in my basement workshop, where I had been spending increasing amounts of time lately. It was the only space that still felt like mine. The house had gradually transformed over the years into Elizabeth's domain, decorated according to her preferences and organized by her standards. But the basement remained mine, filled with my tools, my projects, and my way of thinking. I had been working on something for the past 8 months that the family knew nothing about. They probably wouldn't have cared even if they had known. To them I was just old William, tinkering in his workshop and avoiding real life. But this project was more real than anything I had done in years. It began with a conversation I had with a former colleague, James Anderson, at a retirement party in March. James had transitioned to consulting after leaving the city, working with tech startups on infrastructure projects. During drinks, he mentioned something that captured my attention. He explained that the biggest challenge in modern construction was coordination among architects, engineers, contractors, and suppliers, all using different systems, software, and measurements. He estimated that half of all delays and cost overruns resulted from miscommunication. I understood this intimately from decades of experience. James casually suggested that someone needed to develop a universal platform that could translate between these different systems in real time, perhaps using artificial intelligence, which could save billions across the industry. He moved on to complaining about his golf game, but I couldn't stop thinking about his observation. I possessed knowledge that James didn't have. Back in the 1990s, while working on infrastructure for the Shepherd subway line, I had developed a coordination system. It was nothing elaborate, just a method of standardizing communications between different contractors. It had worked so effectively that they used it for years afterward. However, it was analog, paper-based, and limited in scope. The city owned it, and eventually it was forgotten as new technologies emerged. But I still retained the principles, the methodology, and the framework, and I had been considering for years how to modernize it. After that conversation with James, I began working seriously, not just thinking or planning, but actually building something. I taught myself Python, studied machine learning, and read extensively about modern construction technology. Elizabeth assumed I was just wasting time on the computer. The kids joked about Grandpa learning to code. But I was constructing something substantial, a platform, an algorithm, a solution to the exact problem James had described. By November, I had created a working prototype. It wasn't aesthetically impressive, but it functioned. I tested it using old project data I still had access to, and the results were remarkable. The system could reduce coordination time by up to 60%, cut costs by 40%, and identify errors before they became expensive problems. I showed it to James casually over coffee, mentioning our previous conversation, and explaining that I had been tinkering with something. He examined my laptop screen for 5 minutes without speaking. Then he looked at me as if seeing someone completely unfamiliar. He asked slowly if I understood what I had created. I responded that it was a coordination platform. He disagreed, explaining that this was a billion-dollar idea that could change the industry. He asked how long I had been working on it. When I told him 8 months, he laughed in a shocked, almost breathless manner. He was astonished that I had built it alone in that time frame. I explained that it wasn't particularly complicated, since the core principles were solid, and I had simply needed to translate them into modern technology. James leaned back and told me he knew venture capitalists and tech investors. He asked if he could show them my work. I shrugged, wondering what I had to lose given that my family already considered me obsolete. I agreed. That was 3 weeks ago. James moved quickly, connecting me with a firm called Summit Capital based in Toronto that specialized in construction technology. They were extremely interested. We held meetings where they asked technical, business, and market questions. I answered everything confidently, drawing on my 35 years in the industry. I understood the market better than most people half my age. They wanted to proceed and proposed acquiring the technology outright. They offered to purchase the platform, hire me as chief technical advisor, and fast-track development. The initial figure they mentioned was staggering, 7 figures just for the buyout with additional compensation possible if the platform performed as expected. I didn't inform Elizabeth or the kids. What would I have said? I kept quiet and worked with lawyers, signed papers, and finalized the deal. It would be officially announced on December 26th, Boxing Day. The timing's irony was not lost on me. Christmas arrived and Elizabeth departed for the cottage on the 23rd with luggage for both of us, just in case I changed my mind, though we both knew I wouldn't. I refused to appear uninvited at my own family Christmas. Marcus called me on Christmas Eve to wish me a Merry Christmas. He asked if I was doing okay and mentioned that Mom had said I decided not to come. I found his choice of words interesting. I told him I was fine and to enjoy the cottage. There was awkward silence before he suggested maybe next year, and I responded non-committally. After we ended the call, I sat in my living room with a glass of scotch. The house was decorated because Elizabeth had insisted on the tree, the lights, and the complete display despite my solitary Christmas. It felt like a museum exhibit of a traditional Canadian Christmas. I wasn't angry, which surprised me. I had expected to feel furious, bitter, and resentful, but instead I felt calm and even peaceful. For the first time in months, nobody was disappointed in me. Nobody was sighing when I spoke or exchanging glances when I offered an opinion. It was just me, my thoughts, and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I spent Christmas Day working in my basement, refining technical details of the platform since the deal would close the next day, and I wanted everything perfect. Around noon, I made myself a turkey and cranberry sauce sandwich, because tradition still mattered, even if family didn't. At exactly 12 minutes past midnight, as Christmas transitioned to Boxing Day, my phone rang. It was Marcus, and his voice sounded strange, higher than usual and shaking. He asked what I had done. My heart started racing as I asked what he was talking about and whether everyone was okay. He responded incoherently, asking what the hell had happened. He explained that my name was on the news, that the CBC News app had just sent a notification stating that William Henry Davidson, a Toronto civil engineer, had sold groundbreaking construction technology platform to Summit Capital. He stopped speaking, then told me the amount was $8.5 million. I sat down. I had known the announcement was coming but hadn't realized it would be at precisely midnight. I simply confirmed that yes, that was real. Marcus's voice cracked as he asked what was happening and whether it was legitimate. I confirmed it was real, explaining it was the initial buyout with additional compensation possible if performance targets were met, potentially reaching $20 million over 5 years. There was silence before he said he needed to call me back and hung up. 30 seconds later, Sophia called, followed by Elizabeth, then Marcus again. My phone didn't stop ringing for the next hour. I let most calls go to voicemail because I wasn't ready to talk yet. The next morning, I woke to 47 text messages, 12 voicemails, and 6 emails. Most were from family members, some from old colleagues who had seen the news, and a few from journalists requesting interviews. Elizabeth returned home that afternoon by herself. She entered the house without knocking, despite having left me there alone. She stood in the doorway asking why I hadn't told her. I asked what specifically she meant. She told me not to play games and asked about the technology, the deal, all of it. I looked at her carefully, noticing she was wearing the sweater I had bought her last Christmas that she had thanked me for but never worn until now. I asked if she would have been interested. She started to respond but stopped. She said my question wasn't fair. I asked if it really wasn't fair, pointing out that nobody in the family had asked what I was working on or cared about my opinions except to tell me I was wrong. She insisted I could have said something. I countered that I had said many things, that I had opinions, ideas, and thoughts. But everyone, including her, had made clear those things weren't welcome anymore. Elizabeth sat down looking exhausted. She told me the kids felt terrible. I said I was sure they did. She mentioned Marcus was devastated and had no idea I was working on something important. I responded that he wouldn't have cared even if he had known. 8 months earlier, when I told him I was learning to code, he had laughed and made a joke about teaching old dogs new tricks. She started to say he didn't mean it, but I insisted he did. Sophia had made jokes too, and Elizabeth herself had told people at her book club that I was going through a phase, having some kind of late-life crisis by playing on the computer instead of accepting retirement. She flinched and asked who had told me. I said Patricia Montgomery had thought I should know and had also thought it was cruel. Elizabeth was crying now, not dramatically but with quiet tears. She apologized. I asked her to be specific about what she was apologizing for. She said for not listening, for not taking me seriously, for thinking I was just her old, stubborn husband who couldn't adapt to current times. I acknowledged that I was indeed old and stubborn, but pointed out I was never obsolete. She quietly agreed. We sat in silence until she finally asked what happens now with us and with everything. I had been considering this question all night. I explained that the deal would close officially that day, and Summit Capital wanted me to start consulting in January, helping their team develop the platform further. They were discussing expansion, international markets, and partnerships with major construction firms. She clarified that wasn't what she meant. I acknowledged I understood and said I thought we needed to have a real conversation about the last few years, about how we reached this point and whether we could repair things. She asked if I wanted to fix our relationship. That was indeed the question. Did I want to return to being the family member everyone tolerated but didn't respect? Did I want to spend my remaining years carefully managing my words so everyone else could feel superior? I answered honestly that I didn't know. I explained that I knew I had loved her for 43 years and we had built a life together, but I didn't know if I could return to being the person they all wanted me to be. She protested that they never wanted me to be anyone else. I contradicted her, explaining they wanted me to be quieter, less opinionated, more agreeable, to just nod and smile and stop having thoughts that didn't match everyone else's. She didn't argue because we both knew it was true. Marcus and Sophia arrived that evening together, which suggested coordination. They stood in my living room looking uncomfortable like teenagers caught doing something wrong. Marcus began by saying they owed me an apology. Sophia added that they owed multiple apologies. I waited as Marcus continued, acknowledging they had been treating me as if I didn't matter, as if my experience, knowledge, and ideas were outdated, and admitting they were completely wrong. Sophia said what I had built was incredible, and she had been reading online articles describing it as potentially revolutionary for construction coordination. One journalist had called it the most innovative solution to come out of Canada in the last decade. I told them I didn't care what journalists said. Marcus asked what I did care about. I explained I cared about being respected, not because I made money, but because I was their father who had lived 67 years and might actually know some things worth listening to. They both nodded, appearing chastened. I continued that I cared about being part of a family that valued me for who I was rather than who they wanted me to be. I cared about having conversations where my opinions weren't automatically dismissed because I was old or didn't understand social media, or because I actually remembered what happened the last time someone tried a scheme like cryptocurrency. Marcus muttered that the podcast wasn't about cryptocurrency, but about investment strategies. I corrected him that it was about cryptocurrency. He smiled slightly and conceded the point. Sophia stepped forward asking if we could start over, not forgetting everything but trying to do better. I said that depended on whether they were there because they respected me or because I was suddenly worth $8 million. Marcus answered bluntly that it was both. Seeing my expression, he clarified that yes, the money made them realize they had been idiots, but that didn't make them wrong about being idiots. They had been, and if it took this situation to wake them up, he was grateful it happened, even though he was ashamed it had been necessary. I appreciated the honesty at least. I explained what I needed, which was space and time to think about what I wanted from the rest of my life, which might be another 20 years if I was fortunate. I wasn't making promises about family dinners or cottage visits or pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. Sophia said that was fair. I added that if we were going to rebuild our relationship, it had to be genuine, not just everyone being nice because they felt guilty or thought I might include them in my will. Marcus winced and acknowledged they deserved that criticism. I agreed they did. They departed after another hour of awkward conversation. Promises were made and intentions stated, but I had learned enough in 67 years to know that intentions meant nothing without corresponding actions. The following weeks were strange. The story of my platform sale made national news. I received interview requests from business magazines, tech podcasts, and even someone from Dragon's Den wanting to know if I would be interested in being a guest advisor. I declined most of them because I wasn't interested in fame. I simply wanted to work. Summit Capital provided me with an office at their downtown Toronto headquarters. It was nothing elaborate, just a space where I could meet with their development team. They had hired 12 engineers to work on expanding the platform and wanted me involved in all major decisions. It was energizing. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, I felt genuinely alive. I had purpose beyond merely existing, beyond being someone's husband or father or retired civil engineer. I was building something again. Elizabeth and I began therapy in January, surprisingly at her suggestion. We would sit in Dr. Sharma's office every Thursday evening, attempting to untangle 43 years of marriage, examining both the good and broken parts with equal scrutiny. During one session, Dr. Sharma asked when I started feeling unheard. I reflected on the question and explained it had been gradual, perhaps beginning 10 years ago. The kids had become adults building their own lives. Elizabeth had gotten busier with her activities, and I was still working, but the job had become routine. I believed everyone had stopped seeing me as someone who was still growing and changing. I had become fixed in their minds as Dad or William, this unchanging figure who would always be exactly as I was. When asked how that felt, I responded that it felt like dying slowly, like being erased one conversation at a time. Elizabeth was crying again, something she had been doing frequently in therapy. She said she hadn't known and had thought I was happy and content. I acknowledged I had thought so too for a while, but content isn't the same as fulfilled. In February, Marcus approached me with a business proposal combining his marketing expertise with my platform to create a comprehensive solution for construction firms that included not just coordination, but client communication, project visualization, and branding. My first instinct was to refuse in order to protect what I had built and keep it separate from family complications. But then I remembered what I had told him about actions mattering more than intentions. I agreed to review his proposal. It was genuinely good. He had done thorough homework, identified market gaps, and created projections. It was no longer just an idea, but an actual plan. We spent 3 months developing it together. Working alongside my son, I rediscovered aspects of him I had forgotten. He was intelligent, creative, and genuinely talented at understanding market dynamics. And he listened, really listened, not just waiting for his turn to speak. In May, we presented the concept to Summit Capital. They loved it and brought Marcus on as a consultant. By July, he was heading the marketing division for the platform's expansion into the residential construction market. Sophia took a different approach, asking if she could bring her social work perspective to the platform by focusing on how construction projects impacted communities, particularly vulnerable populations. It wasn't about money for her. She genuinely cared about ensuring the technology served people rather than just profit margins. We created an advisory board addressing social impacts with Sophia as chair. Her insights about community engagement transformed our approach to project coordination in residential areas. Elizabeth started taking computer classes, explaining she wanted to understand what I had been doing in the basement all those months. She would never become a programmer, but she learned enough to have informed conversations about the work. More importantly, she started asking questions again, real questions, interested questions, the kind that assume the person you're talking to might know something you don't. By the following Christmas, 1 year after I had spent the holiday alone, things were different. Not perfect or magically healed, but different in ways that mattered. We went to the cottage as a family, all of us plus Sophia's boyfriend with the tattoos who turned out to be a paramedic and one of the most grounded people I had ever met. Marcus brought his new girlfriend, an architect who had heard about my platform and wanted to discuss practical applications. On Christmas Eve after dinner, Marcus asked me to step outside with him. We stood on the cottage deck looking at the snow-covered lake with our breath visible in the cold air. He said he needed to tell me something. I acknowledged him and he continued, explaining that last Christmas when Mom told me not to come, he had been relieved. He thought it would be easier without me there, less tense and less complicated. He paused before revealing it had been the worst Christmas of his life. I started to respond, but he asked me to let him finish. He explained it wasn't just that I wasn't there, but that they had made me not be there. The whole time he kept thinking about all the previous Christmases, all the times he had treated me like an obligation instead of someone who loved them and wanted to help. My 42-year-old son was crying on the cottage deck. He said the platform was impressive and had changed his life, but that wasn't why he was sorry. He apologized because even if I had never built that platform, I still deserved better than what they had given me. I pulled him into a hug as he sobbed against my shoulder. I told him I forgave him and was proud of him for recognizing it and being willing to do better. He asked if I was happy now. I thought about everything that had happened. The real answer was simple. I wasn't invisible anymore, and that's what made me happy, being seen. Inside, I could see Elizabeth laughing with Sophia. It looked like someone's ideal of family togetherness, but it wasn't ideal. It was real, messy, and complicated, and still healing. but real, and worth more than any amount Summit Capital could offer. Later that night, I sat by the fireplace with my laptop working on a new project. I hadn't told anyone yet, but this time it wasn't because I felt invisible. I had learned I didn't need external validation to know my work mattered. I didn't need anyone's permission to keep growing. At 67, I was just getting started. My phone buzzed with a text from James saying my platform was exceeding every projection. I smiled and set it aside. The fire crackled and snow fell outside. Somewhere upstairs, my family slept in a cottage that had almost lost me for good. But I was still here, still working, still proving that obsolete didn't apply to someone who refused to stop growing. That was the real victory. Not the money or recognition, but knowing I had spent 67 years becoming someone worth listening to, and I had finally learned to believe it myself.